Hello, thanks for joining us. I am Leron Brummel. We talk about the mid-year financial review presented by the Ministry of Finance. To talk with me on this, to understand where Guyana has been within the first half of the financial year, November 2020 into June 2021, is Senior Minister with Responsibility for Finance, Dr. Ashni Singh. Dr. Singh, thank you very much for joining me. How are you today?
Thank you very much, Leron. It's a great pleasure to be here. As always, good to see you and good to be on your program.
Great. Thanks very much for chatting with us. The last time we had a chat, we were pretty much looking at some of the things a few months ago of where Ghana was, where it's moving with a emphasis on growth. But before we get into all of that, the mid-year review has been presented and it has generated quite a lot of discussion. How about you give me an idea of what is contained in that review?
Sure. So once again, of course, thank you very much for inviting me on the program. And it's, I think, this engagement is a particularly timely one because, like you said, we've just issued recently the mid-year report on the performance of the economy. And what that report does is it documents economic performance over the first half of the year, in this case, of course, 2021. It provides an update on the execution of the budget as at the end of June, and it provides an updated outlook for the remainder of the year. And that's what mid-year reports typically do, and that's what this report does. You are right, too, that the 2021 mid-year report has generated quite a lot of discussion, even if I say so myself, quite a lot of interest and I believe even excitement. In a nutshell, what the report has documented is that, first of all, of course, the fact that the first half of 2021 has not been an easy period. The Guyanese economy has continued to face the challenges of COVID-19, which we had, in some respects, known would be the case, except that, of course, at the time that we presented the budget, nobody could really predict how long and how deep the effects of COVID-19 would be. What the mid-year report does is it documents the fact that COVID-19 has continued to be an extremely significant and important source of pressure on the Guyanese economy, and we've had to continue to grapple with COVID-19. But it documents also the fact that in addition to the challenges associated with COVID-19, we had an additional very significant shock to the Guyanese economy, and that is, of course, the floods of May, June 2021. And as you know, those floods were extremely devastating. So the report documents these shock in the case of shock in the case of the floods, and continued pressure as a result of COVID-19. But notwithstanding the fact that those challenges persisted or emerged in the case of the floods, the mid-year report documents that, in fact, the Guyanese economy defied these challenges and recorded very significant growth. In fact, the economy as a whole grew in real terms by 14.5%. So that's the entire gross domestic product, including oil, growing by 14.5%. And the non-oil economy alone, so that's the gross domestic product excluding oil, grew by a very commendable and a very positive 4.8%. Now, when you consider the fact that you had the reality of COVID-19, and you consider the fact that you had the flood impacting on a number of sectors in a very significant way, you come to realize that recording growth of 4.8% is in fact an extremely commendable achievement. That growth came from a number of important sectors, and I will mention just a few of them. Within agriculture, rice recorded a very creditable performance, notwithstanding the impact of the flood. The rice sector, in fact, grew
And that had with it other varieties of rice they were also experimenting with as well.
Absolutely. So there were, I mean, underlying rice production is, of course, issues related to varieties and how those will impact things like yield and productivity and so on. So rice production actually grew in the first half of the year. We anticipate some challenges in the second half because, of course, the floods would have affected preparation for the second crop. And so, I mean, notwithstanding that we saw a relatively good performance from rice in the first half, we anticipate some challenges in the second half. A number of other aspects of agriculture also did very well, while there were some subsectors within agriculture that, of course, did face quite significant challenges emerging from the floods. Mining and quarrying returned a relatively mixed performance. Mining in particular did face some challenges as a result of the flood, but other mining, things like sand and quarry stone and so on, recorded very, very significant growth, reflecting the rapid acceleration in construction activity,
infrastructure.
Yes. And so on, the services grew tremendously, largely reflecting the policy stance taken by the government to gradually, in a cautious and measured way, start to reopen the economy while managing COVID-19. So we saw a significant pickup in things like wholesale and retail trade, etc. I should have mentioned also that manufacturing actually recorded quite significant growth as well. And so the sum total of all of this is that despite the very significant challenges faced by the economy arising out of COVID-19 and arising out of the floods of May, June, the economy still grew. Looking ahead to the remainder of the year, we anticipate continued growth, and so the economy as a whole, we're looking at our latest projections, the economy as a whole will grow in the vicinity of about 20%. And the non-oil economy we anticipate will grow. Our current projection is 3.7% real growth in the non-oil economy. I will say that itself is an extremely strong performance considering the impact that the floods would have had on, particularly, like I said, agriculture, forestry, and mining. Those were the sectors that were really particularly affected by the floods. I will go further, if you'll permit me, and say that when we look at this economic performance, we have to take into account what we are building on, or what was inherited. And we must bear in mind that when we assumed office in August of 2020, we assumed office at a time when the economy was literally on its deathbed. So as a result of bad policies for 5 years, as a result of mismanagement of most of the productive sector, as a result of an environment that was hostile to investment and hostile to the private sector, as a result of the refusal to respect the no confidence motion in the first instance, and then the refusal to respect the result of the elections, by the time you got to August 2020, the economy was in a state of free fall. It was in a state of complete collapse. And lots of the sectors were showing the very deep scars arising from from 5 years of neglect and mismanagement. Right. And so rebuilding that really is not and has not been an easy task. And rebuilding investor confidence in Guyana, it doesn't happen automatically. And so having come into office, we had first of all to restore investor confidence in Guyana, international investor confidence in Guyana, and indeed domestic investor confidence in Guyana. And the president moved very swiftly as soon as he assumed office. He moved very swiftly to engage with the private sector, both the domestic private sector and the international private sector. to send a very clear signal that his government, our government, is a government that is you're deeply concerned about economic growth, that is firmly committed to promoting and facilitating private sector investment, that is a government, that we're a government who place at the highest level of priority the creation of jobs and the generation of incomes for people, the improvement of people's livelihoods. So that effort was made in the very early days of President Ali's presidency and set the stage for a rapid renewal of private sector and investor confidence in Guyana, renewed private investment, and as a result of that, resumed economic growth. So what we're seeing here is the result of that effort.
That effort put into play. But before we go, there's a terminology that you used when you were giving the explanation a little while ago. And for the layman in the street, when you say a shock to the economy, and I know you're one of the finance ministers who breaks it down to the layman. When you say the shock in the economy, what does it mean? And two, what systems or what treatment do you apply to a shock?
Sure.
Given that we've seen the increase.
Sure. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you're right. Sometimes I lapse into using these, I fall into the trap of using these terminology, assuming that everybody's...
It's part of your trade.
No, you're absolutely right. So typically when you're doing a set of economic projections, or in the normal state of things, you assume that it will be, I guess, business as usual, that you will not be subject to any surprises, there will not be any sharp negative developments that will shock the system, hence the word shock.
Slow it down or stymie it at some point.
Stymie it, disrupt things, etc. So at the time that we would have prepared Budget 2021, as indeed is the case of, when you're preparing any budget, you assume a certain state of the world. You assume that, you wouldn't have any major natural disasters. You assume that you wouldn't have any major upheavals in commodity prices. You assume that you wouldn't have any major collapses in the global financial system or anything like that. If there is a development that sharply disrupts or can sharply disrupt the normal state of things, then that would typically be what we would consider to be a shock. So, for example, an extreme weather event that was not anticipated. So, in Guyana's case, the most relevant example would be floods.
The floods.
We know that there will always be rain. There is a rainy season, there's a dry season, or there are two rainy seasons and two dry seasons in the year. I think that's changing a little bit now. Those seasons are a little bit less distinct. But you assume that there'll be rainfall and dry season in the normal course of things. But you don't anticipate an extremely heavy incident of rainfall that will cause floods that could devastate your agricultural sector. So if you have an extreme episode or an episode of extreme weather like floods, you could consider that a shock. It's an event that occurs that disrupts production. And so in 2021, we had one such shock. We had an extreme weather episode that disrupted productive activity in a very significant way. You have other, you could have other shocks. Other things that we would describe as shocks. So, for example, if you produce commodities and you export commodities and your economy is heavily dependent on one or two commodities and commodity prices collapse, you could call that a shock, a commodity price shock, because your economy is dependent on exporting a particular commodity and that the price for that commodity collapses because of some external development. Or, it's a surprise, it's an unanticipated development that has a disruptive impact on the economy. Yeah. So the flood we would characterize as a shock, not having anticipated an extreme episode like that. And then you asked, there was a second part to your question.
The treatment of how does an economy You're talking the macro come over, respond to a shock.
Exactly. And I'm really glad that really glad that you highlight that point, because as economic policymakers, it's our duty, first of all, to ensure that we build a level of resilience in the economy that could potentially not completely insulate us. Well, to the extent that we can be completely insulated, we would like to be completely insulated from adverse shocks. But of course, you can't be completely insulated from adverse shocks. But to the extent that we can build a resilient economy that can withstand these surprises, then that's our aspiration. That's where we're aiming to get to a point where our economy is sufficiently resilient to withstand any adverse surprises that we can be faced with. There are many dimensions of building that resilience. Those include, of course, physical investment in infrastructure to ensure that we are better prepared as a country and that we are better able to manage such extreme episodes. But also, diversifying the economy in a way that ensures that we are not overly exposed to one sector or another. That's also, a strategy that is adopted to build greater resilience. But what I want to focus on particularly is the need to respond immediately to the shock, or the need to respond immediately to the disruption that occurred. And this is something that we, as a government, I think we very clearly demonstrated that the floods happened and nobody anticipated that floods of those magnitude, of that magnitude could have happened. But as a government, we responded immediately. The president himself, went out, got a first-hand view of what was happening, sent out his entire cabinet. We all went out, got a very good sense of what was actually happening on the ground. And we unfolded a series of immediate and direct responses. And I'll mention just some of these. One, immediate action to contain the impact of the disaster. So here I speak of deploying emergency pumps to remove water off of the land and out of people's residences as quickly as possible. Firstly, so basically just to remove the flood, bring the flood under control and remove the flood waters. So an immediate response to remove the flood waters in order to minimize the impact of the flood on the economy and on households going forward. So that was the first thing. Secondly, shoring up critical infrastructure that would be part of our defense mechanism. So shoring up the dams and clearing the canals to ensure that the drainage structures were working, that the dams in the empowered areas were strong and could not be breached, etc. So shoring up of infrastructure. Thirdly, bringing immediate relief to households to ensure that people were safe and well. Deployment of medical hampers, deployment of food hampers to ensure that people, didn't, suffer a humanitarian a consequence, or a sharp humanitarian consequence. Because what you don't want is, you don't want floods to be followed by waterborne diseases, or you don't want floods to have an implication for people's access to, food, and which would then affect their survivability, etc. And so we rolled out the humanitarian response in parallel as an immediate action, getting medication and medical hampers, getting food hampers to people to protect people, which would be of paramount importance. Fourthly, once people were protected and the flood waters were contained and started to be removed, considering what was necessary to mitigate the effects on the productive sector and helping the productive sector to get back on its feet. And here, in particular, in relation to agriculture, providing immediate support to agriculture to ensure that farmers would be able to return to the land and to plant again, because this is not just about production, it's not just about GDP, It's also about having enough agricultural output and having enough food supply to meet the needs of our country.
Food security.
Food security. And so, as you know, the government went on a nationwide effort to document the impact on households and the productive sector, and in particular on agriculture. The president announced a comprehensive package of relief. As you know, that package of relief would have seen almost $8 billion of support delivered to households and farmers. That, in fact, is currently at an advanced stage of implementation. And that initiative is designed not only to bring relief to households, but very importantly is intended to help people in the productive sector, producers, farmers in particular, to go back to the land and to cultivate as quickly as possible. And I mention that because, to come back to the question that you ask, you have a natural disaster, you have a shock to the economy. You want to make sure, first of all, that people are safe, of paramount importance. And you also want to make sure that the impact on your economy is contained, is minimized. Any adverse fallout is minimized. So you want to make sure that production is not disrupted for too long. And this government, I think we have demonstrated over the years, not just in our current term of office, but even in our previous term of office, on the occasions when we've sadly had to confront natural disasters of a similar nature. You would recall that in January 2005 there was a very devastating flood then as well. Even on that occasion, I think we demonstrated in a very clear way that we are a proactive government. We respond very quickly, as we have done in this case. Like I said, first and foremost to protect people, which is the most important thing. And secondly, to ensure that any disruption to the economy is kept to an absolute minimum. And that's, importantly, Leron, part of the story of why the economy was still able to grow in the manner that it did, notwithstanding that you had, in the first half of the year, you had May and June with floodwaters on the land. And that is a large part of the story of why we are still projected to grow for the remainder of the year, notwithstanding that you'll have the unavoidable fallout from the floods.
Thanks for that explanation. I want to do two things and piggyback on what you've just said and throw you a bit of a curveball coming out. The mid-year review has been presented, generated interest, but not all interest is positive interest. And how would you respond, therefore, to the other part of society saying to you, well, we are not seeing any growth. You're saying there is growth, but I'm not seeing it. What do your figures tell you in terms of how do you say to the man industry that is conflicted at this point in time?
Well, I'll tell you.
We have grown and this is benefiting you.
Well, I'll tell you what. This growth it's not a statistical artifact alone. Growth in the economy might be measured by an economic or statistical construct called real gross domestic product. But it's not, like I said, a statistical artifact. The growth in the economy is visible in every county, every region, and every community. And I will give for you a few examples of how this growth is manifesting itself. I mentioned to you resumed private sector confidence. As soon as we came into office, like I said, we engaged with the private sector. We sent all of the necessary and crystal clear policy signals so that the entire world knows our position on private investment and on growth. And you have seen an immediate response with a dramatic upsurge, first of all, just to give a few examples, first of all, in construction activity. The face of our country is literally being transformed before our very eyes. Businesses are constructing new facilities, new buildings, new factories, new wharves, new warehouses, That's happening. You're seeing it physically. Households are going back to the banks and borrowing and going and getting a house lot and building a home. You're seeing that physically. You've seen a dramatic upsurge in house lots granted. You're seeing a dramatic upsurge in home construction happening. And it's before your very eyes. And these things don't happen by accident. As you know, in the emergency budget for 2020 and followed up in the 2021 budget, we rolled out a number of specific initiatives aimed and targeted particularly at promoting home ownership and making home ownership more affordable. Things like raising the low-income mortgage ceiling, removing the VAT on basic construction materials, etc. Doubling the ceiling for mortgage interest relief, which would make mortgage lending more affordable, etc. So you have a visible upsurge in economic activity. Thirdly, we have placed a very strong emphasis on job creation. And if you consider for a moment literally every sector, so let's take even the traditional sectors. If you take sugar, we have been working to restructure and reopen the sugar industry, and the sugar industry is once again hiring people. As you know, you would have seen they had just a couple of months, or 1 or 2 months ago, they had an event at Rose Hall, Kanji, where they had a job fair there. They had a job
Took
fair
in
there.
hundreds.
That's correct, and they recruited people, a number of persons there. That's one example. 2, we have been working with the mining sector for them to resume their activities. Just recently, I think 2 weekends ago, I was in the Aurora Gold mine. That's a company that, when we came into office, that company was on its knees. It probably had about, I think at the time, they probably had about 100, maybe 109, between 150 and between 150 and 200 employees. They're now up to almost 1,000. They're between 900 and 1,000 employees. That's another 700 or 800 persons who have been recruited. These are Guyanese people who have been recruited who are working there, whether it's heavy equipment operators, people working in the mines, etc. Those people are working. They're earning an income. That's the mining sector, and that's replicated. I mentioned one company, but that's replicated elsewhere.
Right.
If I were to give you another example, you would have seen, and some of your viewers would have seen, that we've been engaging with the telecommunications sector, information and communications technology. So one of the first things that President Ali did when he came into government was to liberalize the telecom sector. That triggered an immediate upsurge in investment in telecommunication services, laying of new private fiber optic cables, including to areas that were previously unserved. So a new fiber optic cable has been laid all the way up to Essequibo. A new fiber optic cable has been laid all the way up to Linden as an immediate and direct result of the liberalization of the sector. But that in turn has then triggered private investment in ICT or technology-based industries that have resulted in creation of jobs. So you have seen that I've been engaging with a number of the call centers and the BPO companies. Just to give you one example, and I could think of multiple examples, just one of those companies alone started in August 2020 with 20 employees. They now have 380 employees, and they're poised for rapid expansion. You would see, for example, that in Linden, just about I think probably about 2 weeks ago, we concluded an MOU with a BPO company. And that company will be reopening the call center. We had a call center in Linden previously, which for reasons that are unclear to me was closed during the 5 years that we were out of office. We are reopening a call center there in Linden. That call center is going to employ immediately 150 persons, and that they're going to get up to 250 persons by next year, June. That's jobs for Lindeners. And so all of that, and I'm only giving you a few examples.
Right.
All of that, those are all manifestations of the economic growth. I mean, to go back to the housing program, because that's such an interesting one. when you resume your national housing program, you're not just giving people a house lot so that they become an owner of a plot of land. Consider for a moment the number of people who will be involved in constructing a home, one home. And then consider the fact that we're giving 10,000 house lots a year. Now, not all 10,000 might start building immediately, but let's say 5,000 start building every year. Consider how many persons are engaged in building one house. Carpenters, masons, plumbers, electricians, painters, truck drivers bringing material. Think about it.
General labor.
And so the reality is that there are this growth has manifested itself. I mean, if you look, for example, and let's take here again, I mean, just stick with the theme of job creation. If you look at, for example, I mentioned the call center in Linden, so we went and we signed this MOU, and the owners of the call center, they held a mini job fair immediately. I think almost 500 persons turned out there, registered their CVs. They had an event on the 1st and 2nd of October when they invited Lindeners to come and register their insurance. That's job creation. I saw recently, just a few days ago, an advertisement by another company. This is the shore-based company. The shore-based is having a job fair. I think I saw they sent an invitation for me to attend, I think, or invited me to visit at a convenient opportunity. They have 3 venues at which they'll be hosting job fairs, recruiting people.
And this is in the oil.
And that's in the oil and gas and ancillary support services sector. And then, of course, there's all of the work that we're doing in agriculture to open up new lands that will result in tens of thousands of acres of land, new cultivation, additional acreage for crops, both traditional crops and new crops. His Excellency just went and visited a pioneering new development that's planting corn and soya. You would have seen those pictures of beautiful and expansive fields, with large expanses of corn being cultivated and soya being cultivated. New crops that you're going to see. Here again, you're going to see very significant acreage under those new crops. That's all part of the story. And so the economic growth is happening. It's happening in all of the sectors of the economy. In some cases, like I said, some have had some short-term disruptions as a result of the flood, but the foundations are being laid. What you're seeing here is the laying of a foundation for very strong, sustainable economic growth well into the medium and long term. And that growth is not going to be driven, a lot of it, of course, is going to come from oil, because oil is very important and of increasing importance in the economy. You saw, for example, an announcement of an additional find this morning. That announcement was made. So oil and gas will, of course, be an important part of the economic growth story going forward. But the non-oil economy, which I have been at pains to speak about, on every available opportunity, is also going to be a very important part of this story. And here I speak of things like agriculture, tourism and hospitality, logistics and services, financial services, information and communications technology. All of those sectors are poised for rapid growth. And that rapid growth, like I said, will not only manifest itself in a percentage that we will cite, the economy growing by 4.8%, which is very important, but it will manifest itself also in jobs, in incomes, in production, in improvements in productivity, and in prosperity.
We talk about a lot of that. What we couldn't talk about in specifics, but where government would have put quite a bit of investment, is all of this is happening in the time of the pandemic. So a lot of investment went into the health sector, upgrading hospitals, upgrading regional, purchasing of the vaccines and everything going into that as well. But we're coming down to our time. This is how our time leaves us usually.
Sure.
We haven't exactly spoken about FDIs, foreign direct investment, and investor confidence coming into the Guyana market, even during a period of this COVID pandemic, and government wants to safely reopen the economy, balancing it out, trying to get to herd immunity. Is there a projection in terms of what Guyana can benefit from and how it benefits and moves forward from direct investment?
Absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing is a very exciting story in relation to foreign direct investment and the level of international investor confidence in Guyana. So here again, I mean, certainly in oil and related services, ancillary services, or support services to the oil sector, that's a well-known story. And lots of the biggest companies in the world are establishing operations in Guyana, or are looking at Guyana as a prospect for establishing operations. In many cases, many of those companies see Guyana as their new regional hub. So you have companies that provide support services to the oil industry, and they see Guyana as the place where they can locate their hub for this part of the hemisphere, or even this part of the world. So to give you an example, some of the companies that are providing support services to ExxonMobil, for example, are also looking down the road, and they're looking down the road at a time when Suriname will also become a major oil and gas producer. As you know, they're at an advanced stage of exploration, and all indications are that Suriname will also become a major player in the oil and gas sector. The support services companies that have come and located in Guyana to support ExxonMobil are also looking down the road and thinking, Guyana is the logical place, having established operations, to also serve the Surinamese oil and gas industry, and even the industry within this part of the hemisphere, Northern South America, Central America.
Gateway to South America.
Absolutely. So you have, I would say, the highest level of international investor interest in Guyana relative to any other point in time in our country's history. But beyond oil and gas, if you look at every other sector, the same is the case. So to give you just a few examples, in the non-oil sector, we have large investors looking at things like large-scale agriculture, including from elsewhere in the region. Our neighbors in the south, Brazil, looking at large-scale agriculture, recognizing the potential for large-scale agriculture in Guyana. Looking at agro-processing opportunities, because of course, having produced primary commodities, the logical next step would be agro-processing. And without a doubt, once we complete the gas-to-shore project and we ramp up our capacity to generate electricity more reliably and more affordably, without a doubt, sectors like manufacturing and agro-processing will take off astronomically, meteorically. You have international investor interest in literally every other sector. So you've seen the number of investors who have lined up to say they would like to open international hotels in Guyana. Some, of course, are domestic companies, but quite a few are international companies, including some very big brands who are interested in coming to Guyana.
And as history tells with the big brands, they come with a crowd.
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned, information and communications technology, the ICT sector. We have some large international players who have said very clearly they're interested in either coming to Guyana or in scaling up their presence in Guyana. And we've seen that recently. We saw just very recently, to give you the call center example again, we saw very recently a large regional call center. This is ITEL of Jamaica, acquiring a call center in Guyana, coming into Guyana, acquiring a call center, looking to ramp up their operations in Guyana, and seeing Guyana as a major source of growth for their activities across the region and across the hemisphere. And so I would venture to say that in literally every single sector, including sectors that are relatively new. So for example, we've always had a private healthcare sector, but we now have international companies that are looking to set up things like, specialty hospitals and,
labs
labs and all of those things in the healthcare sector. including big international players, big international companies. And so I anticipate that you will see more of this going forward. I anticipate that you will see continued strong investor interest. And that is a direct result of the policy environment that we have created since we have assumed office.
You talk about creating that policy investment, and from your end as finance ministers, as we wrap the interview, what policies were put in place, or some of the major ones put in place in the first half of the financial year, that you expect to take us through for this anticipated growth?
Sure. So I will mention just a few things that in our experience we have, we know to be of paramount concern to the international investor community, to the private investor community, international and domestic. First of all, of course, is the rule of law. Any investor wants to know that they are coming to invest in a country, or they're investing in a country where there is democracy, where there is a government that respects the rule of law, where they don't have to be worried about unconstitutional behavior or illegal behavior or expropriation of property, etc. We have demonstrated that. We've demonstrated that we are a government committed to democracy. We're a government committed to the rule of law. And I think that signal has been sent very clearly and in a very demonstrable way. That's first and foremost. So legal, and related to that, I would say legal stability, stability of the legal environment. Secondly, macroeconomic stability and predictability. People don't want investors, international and domestic investors, don't want to invest in an environment where they have to worry about economic instability or unpredictability or volatility, because volatility threatens potentially the value of your investment. Yes. And so we have similarly moved immediately to, create the conditions that are conducive to strong but steady and stable economic growth, and macroeconomic stability more broadly, things like exchange rate stability, interest rate stability, price stability, etc. All of the things that are important to ensure that you have a favorable and stable macroeconomic environment. That's the second thing. The third thing that I would mention is investment in enabling infrastructure, because companies that are investing want to come to an environment where the critical supportive enabling infrastructure is in place. In some cases, that might be transport infrastructure, good roads, good ports, good airports, access to land where land is needed, etc. You know that we have announced in our 2020 and 2021 budgets an ambitious program to roll out aggressive infrastructural transformation, not just upgrading of existing roads, but rolling out of a vast new roads network, including roads like the number 52 and number 58 roads in Berbice that will be linking the Quarantine Highway with the Kanji Creek. That's going to open up probably 40,000 to 50,000 new acres. Opening up the Parika, or constructing the Parika to Goshen Road, and the road from that will link, essentially that will run from Bartika to Timeri, but on between the Essequibo and Demerara rivers.
And you've got the East Bank
the
road.
New East Bank, the new 4-lane road on the East Bank, the bypass and alternative routes on the East Bank to ease the traffic congestion on the old East Bank Road, but also simultaneously opening up land that potentially will create tens of thousands of house lots and acreage for investment and business and commercial purposes as well. But in addition to that, infrastructure also relates, of course, to things like teleconnectivity, etc. And so investing in critical catalytic infrastructure would be the third point that I would make. Fourthly, and I could go on, but I will stop at number 4, investing in human resources, because people also want to invest in an environment where they know that they'll be able to draw on a pool of talented human resources. And this, President Ali has placed at the top of his policy agenda, investing in people and investing in people acquiring a quality education. I'll mention just one example, the Gold Scholarship Program.
Yeah.
And under the Gold Scholarship Program, as you know, we're doing probably 5,000 scholarships or thereabouts, where Guyanese people will be able to use online facilities, sit in their homes and get a world-class education at the higher education level in most cases, or in many cases, I should say, at the postgraduate level. And so what that does is it raises the quality of our, the skill set that would be possessed by our, our already very talented human resources pool in Guyana. Because in general, for a long time, the Guyanese population has been well known for the good quality of our education.
Yeah.
What we want to do now is investing in raising the quality of specialized education, people specializing in master's degrees. If you have a bachelor's degree, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, specializing in a particular area of interest in your bachelor's degree, and importantly, investing heavily in technical and vocational education as well.
You need the tradesmen and the skillsmen. Minister,
Absolutely.
we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for chatting with us. We're chatting with Senior Minister with Responsibility for Finance, Dr. Ashni Singh. And of course, we were looking at the mid-year review of the fiscal year for Guyana, November 2021, ending June 2022. Thanks very much for chatting with us, Minister. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember to be safe in this COVID pandemic. Have a good one.